Welcome to the first video in creating geometry. If you skip the last video on the interface because you're already familiar with the Rhino interface, perfectly fine. We're going to start from scratch in creating our project. And as you can see here, I have a sketch for a chair design with different details that I'm going to use throughout the course to show you how to utilize Rhino in many different ways. We're going to go over spec sheets, rendering, and 3D printing out of Rhino using these different components for this design. You can either choose to do your own design or you could follow along with the sketch provided. So I'm opening Rhino 7, and as it opens, I'm going to select small objects inches, since that's the scale I'm going to prefer to use for this chair design. So save changes to my Untitled, no. Now I'm right here, and I can make sure that I have inches down here for my status bar, and that's correct. Now the first thing is I want to bring my sketch in to work off of. I'm going to drag in from my files, my sketch. I'm just going to drop it in my top view. For my top view, once I drag that in, it's going to come up with this little message box. And I'm going to select to bring it in as a picture. If I bring it in as a picture, I'm going to type in 0, enter to place it at the origin, and I can proceed to click anywhere else in the space to set it down. So I'm just going to put it right there. Now, in order to follow the correct scale, we're going to start to introduce lines. So lines are going to be useful to create a cage from which we're going to work from. There are different lines that we can use for many different purposes, but for now we're just going to stick to a single line segment. And we're going to use a single line segment to be able to scale the sketch into the size that we want for the furniture piece. So I'll go ahead and type for the line command, or you could also select the polyline command over here on the toolbar on the left. Type line, I hit spacebar, enter. I can start laying down my line. So I want the overall depth of this chair from this line right here to this line over here. And as I'm drawing this line, remember you could hold shift to set a perpendicular line without having to set ortho. So we'll hold shift to set the toggle ortho, and I'll click on the other end right there. Now I'm going to scale this line along with the sketch to be the dimension that I want. So I'm going to select both of them by using a selection box from right to left. So I'll click, hold down, and drag from right to left to select everything the box touches. So I'm going to use the scale command here to use this line to take the sketch to the dimension that I want. I'll first have to set a base point, so I'll set that down here. Notice I also have object snaps on at the lower status bar. That allows me to select endpoints and have the cursor snap to it if that's not working for you at the moment. Again, all these things about the interface, if you haven't caught them or you feel like you need to review this, you can always go back to the interface. Now I'll select my first reference point for the scaling operation. So I'll click the other endpoint of this line. And now I'm going to type in how many inches I want the depth of the chair to be. So I'm going to type in 32. And that scaled the drawing up. But now I know I can work off of this sketch, and the size of my furniture piece or my design relative to that top view is going to be to scale. So I could start there. We're going to start to set our constraints using lines. So I'm going to use, first off, a rectangle. In this video, I'm going to use a sculpting method, which is much more free-flowing compared to precision modeling, which I'll go over in the next video. So here, we're not necessarily concerned with exact measurements. We're just going to worry about proportions. Now, I'm going to draw out this rectangle. I'm going to start somewhere that's easy to reference, such as this corner right here. I'm going to draw out this rectangle and pick another point that's easy to reference. Since my box is getting drawn out, I can align it to the other edges. Now, here's one very important tool that comes along in Rhino 6 and 7, which is that you can control individual elements of any curve, line, surface, or mesh. So what that means is, if I select the rectangle right now, it's going to come up as a curve. Notice that when there's many objects that are overlaid together, and I go to select it, it gives me a little selection menu for everything that I could select where I just clicked. If I don't want to be selecting the sketch anymore, which I don't, I just want it to stay in the background and not interfere with my work anymore, I could select the sketch, go to my standard toolbar, and lock it, right? So that way, it's not interfering with me anymore. If I ever need to unlock it, I would just right click on the lock command I just used on the standard toolbar. Or I could also use the commands lock and unlock. So, as I was saying, now I'm able to select the rectangle unencumbered. And if I wanted to just select one side of the rectangle and move it down with the gumball, I would use Control Shift, which allows me to do selective. So in order to select this line segment, I'm going to hit Control Shift. And that allows me to use the gumball on just this curved segment. And so I'll move it over to the edge. And there we go. Now, if I switch over to my perspective view, you can see there, I have everything neatly lined up, or on top of each other, rather, at the moment, at the C plane. So the 0 plane of the 3D model. So I can build up from here. So now that I have that base rectangle, I'm going to set the height. And the way I'm going to set the height is I'm going to duplicate my sketch. So now I need to unlock my sketch. I can use Control-C, Control-V on a PC, Command-C, Command-V on a Mac to copy paste it in place. And then I'm going to click on the arc here on the gumball and type in 90. That allows me to then move the sketch with the gumball and align the side view of the chair with the top view in 3D space. It makes it very easy to then build things out properly. I can always go into a side view. And there we are. It's rough, but it's good enough. So this way I can now copy the rectangle to set the height constraint. Now, I could Control-C, Control-V, right, or copy paste. Instead, I'm going to use the copy command. So if I use the copy command in Rhino, I can now click anywhere here in space on the right view. And by doing so, I can now move it around on this plane. And remember, if I hold Shift, I can lock it to the Z-axis. So as I'm approaching the line or the top of the chair, the line for the top of the chair, I'm going to check on the bottom left of the status bar. And it says right there 29 inches. So I'm just going to round up to 30 inches for the height. So now I'll let go of Shift, type in 30 inches, hold Shift again so that my 30 inches are locked to the Z-axis, and now click. And then I hit Enter to finish my copy command, or else I can keep copying. So now I have an inferred cube that I can work within. I'm just going to use the same techniques, right? So using the rectangle tool to draw out right here and try to get the proportion of the armchair, right? Or the... And I'm going to repeat this process using the different curve commands to set up my wireframe for my model. So I'm going to use a rectangle here. You can see here that I would want to make this 2 inches. And notice for the rectangle, I typed in 2 inches, and that allowed me to constrain one side, and now I have to set the direction for the other. I'm just going to snap to the other end of the curve. Another command you could use, since I'm using the same constraint on the other side, would be mirror. So if I use the mirror command, I can now get this rectangle for the arm on the other side of the chair as well. On my object snaps down here, I have midpoint selected. That allows me to mirror at the midpoint of that constraint. So after clicking and setting that in, I have my rectangle mirrored over to the other side. I would also want to set the feet. So I'll use the rectangle and mirror commands to do just that. I'll align right here to where the handle ends, set a footprint for that. I'll then select it and use the mirror command, mirror on this axis, and then use my selection tools. So by left clicking on that first curve I created, and then holding Shift and clicking the next curve that I just created, I can then mirror on the other axis. And that allows me to place the feet back. Although in this case, this would be if you were making a chair with 4 legs, which is something I standardly do, but in this case, I have only one in the back. So for the one in the back, I'm going to more or less just draw out a rectangle for that shape. Then I'm actually going to use the gumball to drag it out here and use the move command to then grab it from the midpoint and place it on the midpoint of the other shape or the other line segment. Now that we've laid down a foundation to work in, let's blow up our perspective view and let's work in here to create 3D geometry. Now, we've already gone over some organizational tools such as locking, right? We can also hide objects. So for example, currently I don't really need the side view anymore. So I'm going to select the side sketch and I'm going to click on this light bulb here to hide the object. And again, I'm going to lock the sketch in the bottom because I still want to reference that, but I don't quite need to manipulate it anymore. Another organizational tool I wanted to bring up here was layers. So currently, everything we've created, the sketch and the wireframe, have landed on our default layer, which is one of many layers created by the Rhino template. So we have many other layers here. The check mark shows our active layer. So I'm going to change our active layer to layer 1. Now I'm going to lock our default layer and I'm going to rename it our sketch. And so now we know so now in layer 1, I'm going to actually start modeling very primitive geometry. So I'm going to call this primitive. Now, my modeling approach is to basically trace over the same shape many times and possibly alter very specifics of it a few times. Using layers allows you to create very basic geometry that then you can duplicate as a new layer and add more detail to. You'll always be able to reference back into what you were working with previously, as well as separating different elements of the model into layers. This will allow for many different applications later. So for now, follow along on how I split up and organize different elements of this model. So in my primitive layer, I'm going to start to create boxes. So I'm going to go over here and use the box command from the toolbar, or you can also type in box. Now, I'm going to start with one of the legs. So I'll click over here and just trace these lines on the default layer and start building this box upward. And I'll go ahead and bring it up all the way to my top constraint. Now I want to do the same thing for the other side, so I'll go ahead and use the mirror command for that element. And now I'm going to start manipulating a lot of 3D objects. So I'd like to switch to my shaded view. I'm going to select this drop down arrow right next to perspective and select my shaded view. Now I can preview my 3D geometry as solids. This makes it easier to move around the model, and I can always switch back to wireframe if there's any instance that it becomes easier to use that. There's many different ways that you can build geometry in Rhino. You can continue to use the commands I've been using, such as box and mirror, or you can also copy paste these boxes and then select each face individually to then drag them or resize them to wherever you'd like. I'm going to show you a little bit more of that. So I'll go ahead and copy paste this leg, and it copies into place. I'm going to use the rotate tool, or rotate, to set a center rotation, and that's going to be right here on this corner of the leg. Now I'm stuck to the XY axis, right? That means the flat axis. So I can only really rotate this leg right now by spinning it around. What I want to do is I want to create the horizontal side of the armchair. So I'll go ahead and go into my side view, and I'll use that rotate tool to use the correct axis. And so that will allow me to snap onto the line that I set up for myself that's horizontal, and there I have my arm. Now my arm's extending too far out, so I need to reel it back in. I'm going to use Control-Shift to select this face right here, and then use my top view to drag the gumball down to where that arc would meet. So notice I'm going in and out of perspective view, top view, and right view to whatever suits the current thing that I'm trying to modify. Let's continue building the basic frame for our chair. I'll now copy paste that rectangle, use the move command to move the top of that member down to the midpoint of this vertical leg. After doing that, I'm going to use Control-Shift to select just that face and use the move command to only move that face. all the way to the other side. And now my object snaps has perpendicular on. So I can snap to the perpendicular end of the other side here. So I have currently the seat right at the middle. Let's bring back our sketch to see where that's supposed to land. I'll go ahead and right click on hide to unhide my object. Remember to unlock the layer that object is hidden in, otherwise it won't show up. So I see that the seat is actually much lower. So I'll go ahead and select it and use the gumball to move it down lower. I can also see that the seat is actually within the bounds of the legs and extending outward. So I'll make these modifications very easily. I'll use the scale command to resize this rectangle from its midpoint all the way to its end. That way I don't have to make the changes on one side to the other. But notice that the entire thing is scaling together, right? I want to keep the same thickness that it has. Therefore, I'm going to use the command scale 1D, which allows you to scale in just one dimension. And if I scale in just one dimension, I'm basically stretching it on that axis. You could also use the stretch command, which in this case I could use in order to get this plate all the way out to where it's supposed to be. So I'm switching over to my top view while I'm running the stretch command on this axis. And the stretch command works similar to the scale 1D. You have to set one object to stretch, and then you set one point to stretch from, one point to, and then you set that dimension. And I'm going to snap to my front constraint. And there we go. Very simple process of starting to create geometry and allowing yourself to be able to make quick changes to the overall scheme before you get too compromised, or too committed rather, into your design. Here's a different way to create geometry. Right here where the two arm pieces join, I wanted to have a curved piece to infer a much more detailed piece I'm going to make later. So in order to do that, I'm going to Control Shift on the top surface and move it down from this corner and snap it right down here. Now what I'm going to do here is I want to create a beveled end. So I'm going to use an arc. And to do so, I'm going to select over here on the left for arc. I'm going to bring up this bigger menu and I'm going to select one of these arcs here that allow me to use an arc with a start and end point. I'm going to go ahead and use this one right here called arc, start, end, and then direction at start. And I'm actually going to draw this arc from my side view, which means that once again, before running this arc, I need to hide my sketch. There we go. Bring up that arc. We're going to go ahead and draw this arc from this corner to this corner, and we're monitoring what's happening here in 3D and perspective view. So clearly I didn't click on the right ones. So instead of clicking through the right view, I'm going to click on perspective view. And now my arc is kind of hard to control after having select those corners, which is why I'm now going to set that third point in right view. Set the first 2 points of the arc in perspective view, and the last point I set in right view. And remember to hold Shift down to make sure that you're getting everything perpendicular. So there's my arc, looking very nice. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to draw out the rest of the shape so that it's a solid object. What I mean by that is if I were to use the extrude command on this line right now, so I'll use extrude, and I'd go to extrude this curve, it allows me to create a surface from this curve on an axis perpendicular to where the curve is located. So if I draw it over here, the problem is I still have this opening, right? I'll go ahead and delete that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw the lines that would fill the rest of the corner. Just an L right there. Next, I'm going to select that L, and I'm going to hold Shift to also select the arc, and I'm going to use the join command. And if I read the command prompt, it says two curves joined into one closed curve. So now I'll do the extrude command. And when I get over here, I notice that it's still open, but actually there's these other side surfaces, right? It's just not closed. And I did this to introduce two things. Either you could use the cap command, which if you have planar openings, cap will close those openings. Or when you're doing your extrude curve command, you have an option in the command prompt to make it a solid by typing S. and now it says solid yes, and I'm able to just make a solid when I extrude. Always keep in mind there's commands that help you do things that perhaps some modifiers for other commands already have integrated into them. No big deal, it's just something to be aware of. The last thing I want to introduce is how to apply a surface onto a curved line so that a surface basically follows a curve. So for that, we're going to start in our top view, and I'm going to use the same arc we've just used to draw a new arc. I'm going to make sure to go back to my sketch layer to draw this arc. And I'm going to draw the arc that comes from the outside of the arm, outside of the back. Hold shift in order to make it perpendicular. And once again, I'm not drawing the right points. So make sure that you're using your 4 different views to get the right point. I'm going to use perspective over here to make sure that I get my constrained geometry to be where my arc is drawn. And so I'm drawing from the edge here to the rectangle that I drew for the back. Once I do that, I'll go into my top view and hold shift. It's a little bit outside of where I want it, but by holding shift, it's snapping there. I'm going to go with that. Next, I want to create the inner curve. So I'm going to go ahead and do an offset in order to create this curve, only offsetted either direction on either side of the curve. So the first thing I want to do is set the distance myself. So I'll hit D for the command modifier in order to set a new distance. And I'll set the same width that I had set over here for the rectangle. Now I'm able to offset that far away. You're not able to see it very much because it's overlapping with a black line. But I'm going to go ahead and end the offset command there. And for you to see that line, I'm going to go over to my layers. I'm going to click on here where it's black. I'm going to change the color to a bright orange so you can identify that curve much better. There we go. Now what I need to do is I need to copy this arc. Copy the arc over to where my arm ends. There I'm going to switch back my primitive geometry layer, and I'm going to start building from here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the command duplicate or DupFaceBorder. So DupFaceBorder. That's going to allow me to then select a face on any geometry, and it's going to give me the border of that face as a curve. That allows me to now utilize that face. So I'll do the extrude, or sorry. So I'll do the sweep 1 command. Sweep 1 command because we're only going to be using one rail, which we have to select now. And our rail is this arc that we set here. And now we select our cross-section curves, which would be the face border we just duplicated, right? Nope, not there. So you hold Control to deselect if you select the wrong thing. And then I select that curve, press Enter when done. I am done. I have to set a seam, which in this case, I'm going to leave it to the default. I'll hit spacebar or Enter again. And I get this little options menu. As I change the options here, I'll be able to see the changes live made to the furniture or to the geometry piece. So you can set your settings and then just let it run or hit OK on that window, and we've got our revolving. I'll now copy my middle piece up here, extrude that upward, and I can actually see that it's not fitting correctly, or my middle piece was too large to begin with. So I'm going to bring my middle piece over to the end over here of where the other side is, rotate it 90 degrees. Once again, use the move command to align it to the edge of this arm. Notice I have near selected on the object snaps, so I can select any point on this curve. And I can see that it actually is in fact thicker, and I don't want it to be so. I'm going to use Control Shift to click on the side of this box here, move, and I'm going to move until this side is perpendicular and matches that thickness. So that's the only thing I've changed on this piece. But since it was aligned to the middle, I can easily bring it back to my constraint line by simply using the gumball, the move command, or the rotate command. And there we are. We could see now that even though I did that, my sweep did not meet that face properly. So I have to make another change. I'm going to delete this sweep, and I'm going to create a new one. I'm going to make sure that my piece here is actually lined up to the end of the rail right there, so that my surface corner meets the end of the rail. I'm going to duplicate the face border for this one. And the reason why I want that one is not because I'm going to use one or the other, but because I'm going to use both. It's going to force to make that sweep fit both cross sections and then use that rail to run that geometry. I'm going to use sweep 1 again, select the rail, the arc. Now select my cross section curves, select both profiles that I've extracted here, hit enter, make sure that the seams are identical or at least matching on both pieces, hit enter again, and we've got here a perfectly fitting arc. Now I can delete what's on the right side of my chair, select the geometry that's on the left, use the mirror command to place it on the right. I'm just going to end by drafting the leg by doing the same thing that I did for the arm. I'm going to go into perspective view and I'm going to create that arc from top to bottom. Use the side view to select. Now notice when I select the curve, I get some control points. So now that I've created a curve, but it's not quite the curve that I want to have, I'm actually going to modify it using those points to show you how to manipulate a curve by using its control points. And if you don't see your control points, you can always see them by typing in the command points on and then clicking on any object for which you want to see those points. And that fits much better. Let's go ahead and go for a sweep. Here's our rail. And here's our cross section. I actually need to duplicate the face of this top piece in order to do my sweep. Select my rail, select my cross section. Seems okay. Now I have something funky happening down here. My curve isn't quite made correctly. Let's just go ahead and delete it. I showed you how to change those points, but I'm going to go ahead and delete. So once again, I'm going to set up my arc in perspective view. So what I'm going to do this time is actually set up an interpolated curve. I'm going to go ahead and go into perspective view and start right here where we have a control point curve. I'm going to click there. I'm going to start drawing at the bottom face. Then I'm going to go into my side view so that I can draw out my curve using multiple points to get to where I want to go. Now you'll notice in perspective view, it's kind of a funky line because it's snapped all over the place. However, in right view, it looks perfectly fine. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to select it and I'm going to do a command called project to C-plane. Delete object inputs. Yes, I don't want this weird curve. I want to project this curve flat onto the plane so that I can get the profile that I want. And then I'll move that curve into position in order to run my sweep command. Select rail, select cross sections, enter, switch up my settings here a little bit and see how that changes the chair a little bit, and hit OK. Lastly, I'm going to move this back face over to meet the surface. It has to sort of clip in it, but I'm just looking at the side view here, and for now that's fine. From this point on, we're going to be using precision modeling to start adding details to this model. So be sure that you understand how to input commands and how to organize your geometry into different layers up to this point, as now things might get a little bit more tricky.